The observation deck hummed with the electric tension of 1,000 species holding their breath. Commander Kane stood before the reinforced glass, watching distant stars blur into streaks of light as the fleet prepared for jump, his reflection ghost-like against the void. Behind him, the newest batch of recruits, human, mostly lined up in perfect formation, their pressed uniforms still crisp, their faces still soft with the innocence of those who'd never seen real combat. The air recyclers whispered overhead, mixing the sense of ozone and nervous sweat, while holographic displays flickered with tactical data that painted the walls in shifting shades of blue and amber. General Thraxel entered through the portside hatch, his Katanus armor catching the light like oil on water, compound eyes scanning the formation with the cold efficiency of a predator selecting prey. The Valorian commander moved through the ranks with deliberate slowness, his forearms clasped behind his back, mandibles clicking in a rhythm that his species used to express disdain. Private Jackson, barely 20 standard years, fresh from the colonies of Proxima, stood at attention with the others, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. The general paused before him, leaning close enough that Jackson could smell the ammonia-sweet scent of Valorian biochemistry, could see his own terrified reflection multiplied in those insectoid eyes. "This is what Earth sends us now." Thraxel's translator rendered his words in flat, emotionless tones that somehow made the contempt worse. "Soft flesh, weak bones. You mammals break so easily." The slap came without warning, backhanded strike from one of those armored appendages that sent Jackson's head snapping to the side, blood blooming instantly from his split lip. The sound echoed through the observation deck like a gunshot, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause, the universe holding its breath. Then Jackson moved. His fist came up from somewhere deep, somewhere primal, driven by generations of human beings who'd been told they were lesser and had decided to prove otherwise. The impact connected with Thraxel's mandible with a sound like breaking pottery, and the general's head whipped backward, green blood spraying across the polished deck. The observation deck erupted into chaos, Halian officers shouting in a dozen languages, human soldiers frozen between discipline and instinct, alarms beginning to wail as security protocols activated. Thraxel collapsed to his knees, 3 arms clutching his shattered jaw, while the 4th scrabbled uselessly at the deck, his compound eyes wide with something that might have been shock or might have been the closest his species came to fear. Kane had Jackson restrained within seconds, 2 MPs hauling the young private backward while medics swarmed the general, their instruments beeping frantically as they assessed the damage. Through the growing crowd, Jackson caught glimpses of faces, some horrified, some awed, some fighting back something that looked dangerously close to pride. An elderly human sergeant, medals from the Mars Rebellion glinting on her chest, met his eyes and gave the slightest nod, a gesture so small it might have been imagined, but felt like absolution nonetheless. The detention cell was a cube of smart glass that turned opaque at irregular intervals, a psychological tactic designed by Valorian architects who understood that uncertainty was its own form of torture. Jackson sat on the curved bench, his hand already swelling, knuckles split and seeping, watching his blood drift lazily in the ship's reduced gravity. The door materialized rather than opened, nanoparticles reconfiguring to allow Ambassador Way to enter, her diplomatic robes somehow managing to look both formal and practical, her expression unreadable in the way that made her dangerous at negotiating tables. "Do you understand what you've done?" she asked, settling onto the bench across from him with practiced grace. "General Thraxel's mandible is shattered in 3 places. They had to reconstruct his vocal chamber. The Valorian High Command is calling for your execution." Jackson flexed his damaged hand, watching tendons shift beneath bruised skin, and wondered if this was how all great mistakes began, with a moment of feeling something true in a universe that preferred comfortable lies. "He hit me first," he said quietly, and Way's laugh was sharp and bitter as surgical steel. Outside the cell, in the corridors where power flowed through invisible channels, the galaxy was beginning to take sides. The human delegation was in emergency session, holographic representatives from Earth, Mars, the Belt, and the outer colonies, all speaking at once in a cacophony of accents and demands. Admiral Chenno, relation to the famous Chen who'd negotiated the first human-alien contact pace before the assembled council, her combat boots silent on the deck, her face carved from the same stone as Mount Rushmore. "For 200 years, we've been the junior partners in this alliance," she said. her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "We've followed their protocols, adopted their hierarchies, let them treat us like promising children who might someday become useful." This recruit did what every human in this fleet has wanted to do. He reminded them that we don't kneel. The Valorian ambassador, his translator glowing with barely suppressed rage, unfolded to his full 3-meter height. "Your species mistakes violence for strength, chaos for independence. The recruit will face trial under Galactic Military Code, and if found guilty, he will be executed as an example." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes earthquakes. In the medical bay, Thraxel lay in a regeneration pod, immersed in healing fluids that glowed with bioluminescent bacteria, his thoughts racing faster than his body could heal. The general had served for 40 cycles, had commanded fleets in the border wars, had earned 17 honors from the high command, and in all that time he had never been struck by a subordinate. The Valorians prized hierarchy above all else. It was encoded in their biology, their psychology, their civilization's very foundation. To be struck by a lesser was not merely assault. It was a fundamental violation of natural order. But as the healing fluids worked, their slow magic, Thraxel found himself reviewing the moment again and again, seeing in his mind's eye the instant when the human's face had transformed from fear to something else entirely. Not rage, exactly, not even hatred. Something more primal, more honest. The look of a creature that had decided, in the space between heartbeats, that death was preferable to submission. It was a look Thraxel had seen before, in the eyes of warriors from 100 different species, but never in a simple recruit during a routine inspection. The trial was held in the Grand Chamber of Justice, a space so vast it had its own weather systems, where the combined legal representatives of 47 Alliance species gathered beneath a dome that displayed the galaxy itself in real time. Jackson stood in the defendant's sphere, isolated at the chamber's center, his dress uniform pressed and proper, his face carefully neutral while cameras from every corner of known space broadcast his image to billions of viewers. The Valorian prosecutor was a specialist in military law, his arguments delivered with the precision of a surgical strike, each point designed to demonstrate that allowing this precedent would shatter the chain of command that held the Alliance together. "If we permit subordinates to strike their superiors with impunity, we invite anarchy," he declared, his translator rendering his words in 17 languages simultaneously. "The recruit must be made an example, or we risk the complete collapse of military discipline across all species." But when the defense rose to speak, it was not a human who took the floor. Sarah, of the Minervan Collective, her crystalline form refracting light into rainbow cascades, moved to the center with the slow grace of beings who measured time in centuries rather than years. "We of the Minervan worlds do not believe in hierarchy as you Valorians understand it," Sarah said, her voice like wind through crystal caves. "We have observed humanity for their brief time in the Alliance with great interest, because they possess a quality that we recognize. They are a species shaped by rebellion. Their history is written in the blood of those who refused to accept that their position was fixed by birth or biology." The chamber's atmospheric processes hummed louder, compensating for the increased heat of so many beings breathing together in tense silence. Sarah projected images into the dome above, scenes from human history that flickered past like memories. Revolutionaries storming Bastilles, suffragettes chaining themselves to railings, workers standing firm against corporate troops, colonists declaring independence from distant powers. Every time humanity was told to accept their lesser station, they chose to fight instead. And now, species far older, far more technologically advanced, have placed them in our military structure and expected them to simply accept subordinate roles without question. We slapped them, metaphorically, for 200 years. Private Jackson merely slapped back, literally. The prosecution attempted to redirect, to focus on the specifics of military code and the sanctity of rank structure. But the narrative was already shifting in ways that legal arguments couldn't control. On the Martian colonies, human workers organized spontaneous demonstrations supporting Jackson, their signs projected onto dome ceilings visible from orbit. On Proxima, where Jackson had been raised, the entire settlement shut down for a day of solidarity. Even on Earth, in the sprawling megacities that had once seemed so distant from the concerns of space, people began to pay attention. The human feeds were full of commentary from veterans who spoke quietly about the small humiliations they'd endured from alien officers, the casual dismissals, The assumption that humanity's late arrival to the galactic stage meant they had nothing to contribute beyond numbers and expendable bodies. An old woman in New Shanghai, who'd survived the Titan mutiny, was interviewed by a dozen networks. "My generation thought we had to earn their respect by being perfect," she said, her face a map of scars and smile lines. "This kid just reminded them that respect works both ways, and if you don't give it, you can't demand it." In a closed session of the Valorian High Command, held in spaces humans were never permitted to enter, General Thraxel stood before his superiors with his jaw now fully healed, the regeneration so complete that no trace of the injury remained except in his memory and pride. The Supreme Commanders listened as he recounted the incident in precise detail, their mandibles clicking in complex patterns that communicated layers of meaning human translators could never fully capture. "What is your assessment of the recruit?" the first commander asked, and Thraxel found himself hesitating in a way he had not hesitated since his first combat mission for decades prior. "Dangerous," he finally said, "but not in the way we typically define the term. The humans are dangerous the way a chemical reaction is dangerous stable, until the precise conditions are met, then explosive. We have been treating them as if they follow our hierarchical instincts, but they don't. They follow something else, something we don't have words for." The first commander's compound eyes reflected Thraxel's image in miniature, dozens of tiny versions of himself staring back. "Are you suggesting we withdraw support for the prosecution?" "I'm suggesting," Thraxel said carefully, "that executing this recruit might create more problems than it solves. The humans have a saying, 'Don't martyr your enemies.' We should consider its wisdom." The verdict came on the trial's 7th day, delivered by a panel of judges representing 12 different species. Their decision, the result of deliberations that had gone through the night cycles while the galaxy held its collective breath. Jackson stood in the defendant's sphere, his face carefully composed, while Ambassador Wei sat in the observer section, her hands folded in her lap, her expression revealing nothing of the frantic diplomatic maneuvering that had occurred behind the scenes. "This tribunal finds," the head judge intoned, their translation matrix rendering the words in every known language simultaneously, "that while Private Jackson violated military protocol and committed assault against a superior officer, extenuating circumstances must be considered. General Thraxel initiated physical violence first, violating the very code he claims to uphold. Furthermore, we must acknowledge that the Alliance's treatment of human recruits has not always reflected the respect we claim to value. Private Jackson is hereby found guilty of assault, but will face a reduced sentence, demotion, confinement to base, and mandatory diplomatic training. General Thraxel will receive a formal reprimand for conduct unbecoming an officer." The chamber erupted, some species outraged, others celebrating, most simply stunned by the precedent being set. Jackson's knees nearly buckled with relief, but he forced himself to remain standing, to meet the judge's eyes, to show the same steel that had gotten him into this situation. In the days that followed, as Jackson began his sentence in a minimum security facility that was more dormitory than prison, the galaxy began the slow work of adjusting to a new reality. Human recruitment numbers surged as young people across the colonies saw in Jackson not a violent criminal but a symbol of something they'd been hungry for validation, that their humanity, with all its messy emotions and rebellious instincts, had value in this sterile galactic order. The military began implementing reforms, establishing clearer codes of conduct that applied to officers of all species, creating review boards with human representation, acknowledging that integration meant more than just adding human bodies to alien command structures. Ambassador Wei visited Jackson weekly, bringing news from the outside, watching as the young man who'd thrown one punch in a moment of instinct slowly realized he'd become a catalyst for change he'd never intended. "Do you regret it?" she asked during one visit, sitting across from him in the common room, while other confined personnel played cards or watched entertainment feeds. Jackson looked at his hand, the knuckles now healed, but still slightly misshapen, and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret that the general felt entitled to strike me. I regret that it took violence to make them listen, but the act itself, no. Because for just one moment, I wasn't representing humanity or making a political statement. I was just a person who'd been hit deciding that I wouldn't accept it. That's not something I can regret." Outside the facility's windows, the galaxy turned on its axis, stars wheeling in their ancient patterns, while civilizations millions of years old grappled with the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the youngest species in the room had lessons to teach. Somewhere in the Valorian sectors, General Thraxel trained new recruits with a fractionally different approach, his mandibles occasionally touching the spot where a human fist had once connected, remembering, and in the human territories, in bars and barracks and assembly halls, people who'd been told for 2 centuries that they needed to prove themselves worthy began to understand a different truth, that worth wasn't something you earned from others through perfect behavior and endless patience. Worth was something you claimed for yourself, even if it meant bleeding for it. Jackson served his sentence with quiet dignity, accepting both the criticism and the unexpected support, understanding that he'd become larger than himself in ways both uncomfortable and inevitable. When his confinement finally ended, he requested reassignment to Border Patrol, to the difficult work of protecting the Alliance's edges from external threats. The request was granted, and he returned to duty with a new insignian, the rank he'd lost, but a special designation created just for him. Galactic Liaison, it read, a position that didn't fit neatly into any existing hierarchy, that gave him authority to move between human and alien units, to serve as a bridge between species still learning to trust each other. It was, in its way, a punishment and a reward simultaneously, a recognition that the man who'd broken a general's jaw with one punch had somehow become exactly the kind of representative humanity needed. On his first day back, walking through corridors that had once seemed impossibly alien and now felt almost familiar, Jackson passed General Thraxel, heading in the opposite direction. They stopped, these 2 beings who'd reshaped galactic politics with a moment of violence, and regarded each other with something that might have been mutual understanding. Thraxel's mandibles clicked once, a sound his translator rendered as, "Serve well." Jackson nodded, his hand unconsciously flexing, and replied, "Always do." They moved past each other then, officers in the same fleet, representatives of species learning the hard way that true alliances weren't built on hierarchy and submission, but on the difficult work of respecting different ways of being strong. Behind them, the ship hummed with the combined breath of 1,000 species, and ahead of them, the stars waited with all their ancient patience for humanity to continue teaching the galaxy what it meant to refuse to kneel. The observation deck where it had all begun stood empty now, the glass cleaned of green blood, the deck polished to gleaming, but the memory lingered like a ghost in the recycled air. Some moments, no matter how brief, echo forever through history's halls. Private Jackson's punch was one such moment, not because violence solved anything, but because sometimes the galaxy needed to be reminded that dignity, once lost, could be reclaimed, even if it cost you everything, especially then.